We need to talk about wolves. No, not the large canines, from which humans inexplicably bred these freaks. I am referring, of course, to Wolverhampton Wanderers. In the third game of the 2017-18 Championship season, Hull City lost 3-2 at home to Wolves. The scoreline makes it sound like a much closer game than it really was. A year after being acquired by Chinese investment group Fosun International, despite having only finished 15th the previous season, this season it was clear the Wolves were serious about promotion. Everywhere you looked from 1 to 11 there was real talent, especially by championship standards. Connor Cody and Willie Bolly formed 2/3 of a steely back three. Barry Douglas and Matt Doherty provided energy and intent as wingbacks. A midfield duo of Ruben Neves and Roman Size had the perfect blend of silk and industry, and on the left side of a front three, a skinny 20-year-old by the name of Diogo Jota just seemed to have something about him. Leaving that game, we were all in agreement, and when I say all, I mean me, my dad, and my dad's friend, that anyone who finished above Wolves that season would be promoted to the Premier League. As it happened, no one did. Wolves racked up a mammoth tally of 99 points, lifting the championship title as certainly one of, if not the most formidable team that the championship had ever seen. It ought to have come as little surprise. Neves became the youngest player ever to captain a team in the Champions League at Porto as an 18-year-old, and set Wolves back almost £16 million. Willie Bolly and Diogo Jota had both played first-team football for Porto, also in the Champions League the previous season, and Nuno Espirito Santo, Wolves' new head coach, had also spent the previous season in charge of the Portuguese Giants. It was clear that this was a club going places, and they wouldn't be looking just to make up the numbers in the Premier League. Following promotion, in came Portuguese legends Rui Patricio and Joao Moutinho, along with Raul Jimenez on loan from Benfica, and in one of the all-time great Premier League campaigns for a newly promoted club, Wolves finished 7th, qualifying for Europe for the first time in 38 years. The following season, they replicated the feat, finishing 3 points above Arsenal this time around, and threatening to disrupt the established order of the league's rich six. Just 3 years on though, now Wolves find themselves in an altogether rather different set of circumstances, and with a very contrasting mood lingering over the club. Ruben Neves, Nathan Collins, Connor Cody, Raul Jimenez, Joao Moutinho, and Adama Traore have all departed this summer, with little in the way of replacements having been brought in, with barely a week to go until the club kick off their campaign away at Manchester United. Amidst fear of FFP violations, talk of one-to-way owners, and, ultimately, the daunting prospect of relegation then, in today's video, I wanted to take a look at how and why Wolves, who were the envy of every club outside of the Rich Six only a few years ago, have ended up in such a mess. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Wolverhampton, which was once described as a large and dirty town by Queen Victoria. Charming, eh? As we take a look at the mess at Molineux, the increasingly fractious relationship between the club's owners, manager and supporters, and why they have barely signed anyone despite raising the best part of £100 million this summer in player sales. I want to start this video by reading out a tweet. Don't worry, it's not one of my own, but one that appeared on my For You feed from a Wolves fan, which reads, "The fact that as a Wolves fan, I'm watching my club get destroyed by FFP restrictions while Chelsea, who spent £600 million last season, can just keep buying players is such an insult. FFP's not for parity, it's for keeping the giants dominant and crushing the little guys." The reason I wanted to start with that tweet is because I think the Wolves fan in question makes one good point, one not so good point, and raises another point that perhaps they didn't even realise they were raising. The good, or at least valid point I think, is that FFP, as they've termed it, though what they actually mean is the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, it's a common mistake, does certainly outwardly appear to be made a mockery of by the spending of certain clubs Chelsea most notably of all at this moment in time, and it does undeniably serve to further cement the status quo and ensure that no team can ever spend as much as those who are already at the top, or are perhaps somehow able to artificially inflate their revenue. Chelsea haven't technically broken any FFP or profit and sustainability regulations, and I made a whole video explaining how and why that is the case, should any of you be interested. But the fact that I had to make a video about that, because so many people had asked for one, is indicative of the fact that, just instinctively, people feel as though Chelsea's spending is out of control, and that any regulations which it falls within are either insufficient or totally meaningless. The not so good, or at least somewhat dubious point in my view, and this is actually how I came across that tweet because there were so many people dunking on it, is that obviously Wolves spent an enormous amount in the Championship, several times their revenue, and they would have broken spending rules in that league had they not won promotion, and the spending didn't stop after they reached the Premier League. In 2 seasons in the Championship under Fosun International, before winning promotion to the Premier League, Wolves spent over £50 million on new signings, and accumulated one of the largest wage bills in the division. Across those 2 campaigns alone, Wolves made enormous pre-tax losses of more than £80 million. At the time, a number of Wolves' Championship rivals even called for an inquiry into the club's spending and whether or not they had broken the rules, which at that time, and indeed still does dictate, that clubs can't lose more than £39 million over any 3-year period in the Championship. Wolves made a profit the year before Fosun arrived, but clearly, if they had failed to win promotion that season, they would have fallen foul of those regulations. As it happened, they won promotion to the Premier League. So whilst Wolves, and everyone else outside of the established Rich Six and now Newcastle, might have every right to feel aggrieved at the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, and Chelsea's attempts to skirt every feasible loophole to spend unprecedented amounts of money in the entire history of football, Wolves are one of many clubs who navigated spending regulations and spent beyond their means, so to speak, in the past. The final point, which isn't raised explicitly but is arguably the most interesting of them all though, is the question of whether Wolves ought to be in danger of breaking the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules at all. After all, Newcastle's net spend over the last 5 years is in excess of £400 million, Aston Villa's is more than £330 million, and even Nottingham Forest, who only won promotion from the Championship a year ago, have a higher net spend than them over that period, despite Wolves spending the entirety of that time in the Premier League, and therefore having had revenue that far exceeded Forest's. It should be noted that £163 million of Nottingham Forest's £175 million net spend came last season alone. So why is it Wolves that we keep hearing about in relation to spending regulations? Well, that is a question that a lot of Wolves fans are asking, and it's not an unreasonable one. So let's get down to brass tacks. Wolves' spending might not have been as eye-catching as Villa, Forest, or Newcastle's in recent years, and indeed, their net spend hasn't been as high, but prior to this summer, they have spent a small fortune. What's more, whereas early Fosun signings like Sace, Neves, Patricio and Jota might not have come cheap, in terms of both transfer fees and wages, they were unmitigated success stories who proved to be worth every penny and then some. More recent Wolves signings, and indeed the club's biggest signings of all, have either been considerably less successful, or at least the jury is still out on that front. Wolves spent between £28 to £37 million on Nelson Semedo, subject to add-ons, a right-back who can't defend, £27.5 to £35 million on Gonzalo Guedes, who didn't want to join the club in the first place, and that was reflected in his performances, £30 million on Raul Jimenez, who suffered a horrible skull fracture just 15 months after permanently signing for the club, from which he is yet to fully recover, £35 million on Fabio Silva, who was just 18 years old at the time and had only ever scored one senior league goal, 38 to £42.2 million on Matheus Nunes, who had a slightly underwhelming debut campaign last season, and most recently of all, £44 million on Matheus Cunha, which was mandated as part of his loan deal. That right there is a total of roughly £200 million, £215.7 million, with add-ons to be precise, on just 6 players. That's more than Brentford have spent, not just on all of their current squad, which finished 9th in the Premier League last season, but in the entire history of the club. Those are not insignificant sums then, and the failure of those players to produce or to provide Wolves with any kind of a substantial return on their investment is reflected in the club's bottom line. In the last 3 years, which is the relevant period for profit and sustainability purposes, Wolves lost £67 million. Still, that puts them some way clear of the danger zone of £105 million, which is the maximum amount that a Premier League team is allowed to lose over 3 years. Broken down though, Wolves' post-tax loss of £39.3 million in 2019-20 was heavily impacted by the pandemic, with the club claiming that they would have actually turned a £17.6 million profit were it not for reduced gate receipts and deferred broadcast revenues. They did return a post-tax profit of £18.4 million in 2020-21, and the big loss, again post-tax, of £46.1 million only came in the 2021-22 season. On the face of it then, given the club's 2019-20 loss will no longer be relevant as per the next set of accounts, you'd have thought that Wolves would be absolutely fine. They essentially have somewhere between £75 to £80 million of wiggle room that they can lose, so to speak, but there are sources, allegedly from inside the club, who have suggested that Wolves could be looking at around an £80 million loss for the 2022-23 season, which is absolutely enormous and would put them firmly in and around that £105 million danger zone. That's because last season was Wolves' highest spending campaign by far, somewhat offset by the sale of academy graduate Morgan Gibbs-White, though their net spend was still roughly £100 million. Combine that with a 13th place finish, no European football, no significant cup runs, paying off Bruno Lage and recruiting Julen Lopetegui, and it is no surprise that last season was a seriously costly one for the club. That's why Wolves fans were warned very early on this summer that existing players would have to be moved on before new ones could be brought in, and that is exactly what has happened. Ruben Neves and Nathan Collins have generated £70 million between them, with Connor Cody, Raul Jimenez, and Ryan Giles taking the club to probably within one decent-sized sale of the £100 million mark, which it is speculated may have been the club's target in terms of sales before the start of next season. Wolves fans have been relatively understanding of the need to move players on before bringing anyone in. After all, they essentially deferred this summer's business to January, having spent a fortune mid-season to ensure survival. It had long been anticipated that last season would be Neves' last at the club, and the £47 million fee, combined with the fact that he wouldn't be joining another Premier League club, seemed like the best possible scenario to most. £23 million from Brentford for Nathan Collins, who I must admit I'm a fan of, is likewise considered to be decent business, given that he effectively ended last season as Wolves' fourth choice centre-back. Cody, Jimenez, and both Moutinho and Traore, who have departed on frees but will significantly ease the burden on Wolves' wage bill, have been fine servants to the club, but there was a general consensus that their time was up and that a separation was probably best for everyone. What Wolves fans have been significantly less understanding about, quite reasonably, is the inaction in terms of incomings despite those departures and the amount of cash that the club has generated. There are gaping holes in the Wolves squad, some of them long-standing ones, and the start of next season is now less than a week away. At centre-back, in central midfield, and most notably of all up front, Wolves are way short of where they need to be just to ensure survival, let alone to start looking further up the table to where they were just a few short years ago. Wolves haven't had a fit and firing centre-forward since Jimenez fractured his skull in November 2020, over 2.5 years ago. This is the 6th transfer window since Jimenez suffered that setback, and still they seem no closer to finding a replacement. It is the single most glaring and unforgivable failure and recruitment error of the Fosun era, and it's why spending a then club record £35 million on Fabio Silva, who had, I reiterate, just turned 18 at the time and had only ever scored one senior league goal, was always an enormous risk. If you're Manchester City or PSG, then perhaps you could afford to spend £35 million on a promising 18-year-old and ease them into your first team, alongside a raft of other options in their position. If you're Wolves, who only had one senior centre-forward ahead of Silva at the time, who soon suffered a long-term setback, it's probably not such a wise idea. So far, it is a risk which has backfired big time, and I say that as someone who actually quite likes Silva whenever I watch him, and I'm not just saying that because some of you think that he looks like me. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that Wolves did sign Sasha Kalajidzic last summer for £15 million from Stuttgart, and perhaps, if fit, he could have provided the solution to Wolves' centre-forward and goal-scoring woes. Unfortunately, on his debut against Southampton, Kalajidzic tore his ACL, but if he can recover from that setback and adjust to the Premier League, he will be like a new signing next season. There were a lot of ifs in there, I know. With a week to go until the start of the season, or less than a week now, Wolves only have 2 senior centre-backs in their entire first-team squad, and one of them is still being linked with a possible move to Napoli. Craig Dawson and Max Kilman actually form a really complementary blend of youth and experience, with plenty of height and contrasting styles between Dawson's more aggressive front foot and no-nonsense approach, and Kilman's excellent technique on the ball and in the pass. Wolves rejected a £30 million bid for Kilman from Napoli earlier in the window, who they value at £40 million, though there are suggestions that a £35 million bid would test their resolve. Unlike with the club's other summer departures, losing Kilman would be a bitter pill to swallow for Wolves fans. A fabulous central defender, and likely a future England international, Kilman is a standout player at Molineux, and despite firm interest from the Italian champions, he has shown no urgent desire to leave the club. If he stays, he now looks likely to replace Ruben Neves as Julen Lopetegui's new club captain. If Dawson and Kilman are to be Wolves' starting centre-backs next season, that's no problem at all, but to have zero depth behind them most assuredly is. Lopetegui has spoken of his desire to have 2 quality players in every position, but in some, such as up front and at centre-back, he's barely got one. In midfield, meanwhile, Ruben Neves and Joao Moutinho played in 35 and 31 of Wolves' 38 Premier League games respectively last season, but both have now departed, leaving Wolves with a gaping hole in the middle of the park, and their only midfield reinforcement, Boubacar Traoré, signed for £9.5 million from Metz, already spent the second half of last season on loan at the club. Wolves are clearly well aware that they need reinforcements in midfield, and their primary target all summer has been England under-20 international Alex Scott. Versatile and extremely gifted, Scott can play anywhere through the spine of midfield, and he played almost an equal number of games in central, defensive, and attacking midfield last season. There is no doubt that Scott will leave Bristol City this summer, but whether he will be joining Wolves is a different question. At the time of this recording, it is widely reported that Bournemouth may have pipped Wolves to the signing of the 19-year-old, having offered £25 million for the teenager, whilst Wolves were reportedly reluctant to exceed the £20 million mark. Missing out on Scott, the one big money signing that Wolves seem committed to throwing all of their eggs into this summer would be a hammer blow for Matt Hobbs personally, and for the club as a whole. Hobbs is Wolves' sporting director, appointed to the role in November 2022, having previously served as the club's chief scout and head of recruitment, meaning that this is his first summer fully in charge of recruitment decisions. Prior to November 2022, Wolves would just sign whoever George Mendes told them to, and whichever of his clients just so happened to be available at the time. I joke, but it's not too far from the truth. and for a while, it actually served Wolves very well. Wolves aren't looking to sever their ties with Mendes entirely. He is too powerful and has too many connections for that to be a wise decision, but they are looking to broaden their horizon and expand their scouting network beyond Portugal into other parts of Europe, Africa, and South America. That will take time though, and Wolves need players now. Hobbs is working with a reduced budget compared to Wolves in previous seasons, so dependable bargains and hungry young players who can be sold for significant profit are the new flavours of the month. Matt Doherty, signed on a free transfer from Atletico Madrid this summer, fits the first mould, as does Aaron Cresswell, at least in Hobbs' eyes it would seem. Doherty knows the club well, having spent a decade at Molineux prior to his departure in 2020, but he failed to produce his best form at either Tottenham or Atletico Madrid, now aged 31. Given Wolves' frailties at right back though, with allergic to defending Nelson Semedo their only option there, and the fact that Doherty didn't command a transfer fee, it is a move which makes perfect sense. Cresswell is perhaps a little bit more debatable. Not yet confirmed, the West Ham man is heavily rumoured to be on the verge of a £5 million move to Molineux following 9 years with the Hammers. There is no doubting Cresswell's talents, and it should be noted that he played 38 games for West Ham last season, but he is also 33 years old. There were clear signs of him slowing down last season, hence West Ham's willingness to let go of him. And at £5 million, it would be fair to say that some Wolves fans feel that money would be better spent elsewhere. What's more, unlike at right back, Wolves have half-decent depth at left back. Hugo Bueno, Johnny, and Ryan Aït-Nouri can all play there, though Johnny may well leave this summer, and despite impressing me every time that I've seen him, Lopetegui clearly isn't a fan of Aït-Nouri, and there is every chance that he'll be on his way as well if Wolves receive a reasonable bid. At centre-back, the only firm target that Wolves seem to have had, that is in the public domain at least, is Swiss international Nico Elvedi, but the club is apparently refusing to meet Borussia Mönchengladbach's €10 million asking price. Elvedi only has 1 year left on his deal with the Bundesliga side, and Wolves' newfound toughness in negotiations may well prove to be welcome in some instances if it prevents them from overpaying for George Mendes' clients. But equally, if it prevents them from actually getting any business done at all, it may end up costing them a great deal more than it saves them. €10 million for an established top-flight international, even with only a year left on his deal, is surely preferable to going into a Premier League season with only 2 senior centre-backs. Another reason why Wolves might have been willing to move fast in terms of Doherty and Cresswell and make Alex Scott their primary summer target, and indeed sign Tom King from Northampton Town as their third-choice goalkeeper, is because the club has another regulatory issue, aside from profit and sustainability, and that is a lack of homegrown players. Premier League clubs can only name 17 non-homegrown players in their squad, which means that in order to name a full 25-man squad, they must have at least 8 homegrown players. Prior to the arrival of Doherty and King, Wolves were down to just 3 in their first-team squad, and that means that they're still 3 short of being able to name a full Premier League squad. It narrows Wolves' pool of potential transfer targets down somewhat, but one would expect them to bring those 3 homegrown faces in by hook or by crook this window. Wolves fans aren't the only ones concerned about the club's recruitment this summer. Manager Julen Lopetegui has hardly been too tight-lipped about his frustrations and concerns, most notably during a pre-season interview with Guilherme Balag in Portugal. That, for me, is possibly the biggest single concern in terms of Wolves' prospects next season. If we accept that the Wolves squad is likely to be weaker next season than last, which I think is almost an inevitability at this stage, Lopetegui is arguably the club's biggest asset. When you compare Wolves with some of the teams likely to be in and around them this season, you look at Lopetegui, whose last 3 jobs were with Spain, Real Madrid and Sevilla before Wolves, and you think that he could be the difference maker that keeps them up. Given how disgruntled he seems, however, if things don't go well, and he doesn't get the additions to his squad which perhaps he would deem to be adequate over the next couple of weeks, it's not unimaginable to me that He could just walk or go so public in his criticism of the owners, a la Scott Parker at Bournemouth, that they've no option but to sack him. And then you'd really start to worry for Wolves. As for the owners themselves, well, it's there that we return to that profit and sustainability issue and the third point, perhaps unwittingly, raised in that initial tweet. If, as it is claimed, Wolves really are looking at an £80 million loss in 2022-23, which we won't actually know for some time, they have no other option but to be frugal this summer. There are some Wolves fans, though, who believe that FFP, as it's usually referred to, is just a smokescreen for an unwillingness to invest, disinterest, and Fosun being ham-fisted as they look to sell the club. Publicly, Fosun deny that Wolves is for sale. Privately, many industry insiders report that they are entertaining bids, whether that be for an outright takeover or minority investors, as a means of getting some external funds into the club. Fosun bought Wolves right at the peak of China's football boom and state-mandated investment in the sport both at home and abroad, but that mandate soon changed, and by 2020, divestment was being actively encouraged by Xi and the CCP. Wolves were something of an anomaly, therefore, in world football, in not only retaining their Chinese owners, but in actually continuing to receive significant investment from them in a marriage that seemed to suit all parties. Fosun's status as a truly multinational corporation with investments all over the globe was long felt to partially immunise the business from the control of the Chinese state. There may well be some truth to that, up to a point, but now Fosun themselves are facing significant headwinds that may lead them to consider football to be an unnecessary distraction. The pandemic, Trump-era trade wars, and the crisis within China's property sector since 2020 have all hit Fosun hard. And in what the company described as a perfect storm in 2022, their profits fell to just £50 million. Following that news, the company announced that they would be looking to offload more than $10 billion in non-core assets. For a Chinese conglomerate focused primarily on pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, fashion, and financial services, it doesn't really get more non-core than a football club in the West Midlands. Despite claiming that Wolves aren't one of their assets that are up for sale, repeated talk of making the club self-sufficient is just a nice way of saying that they no longer want to put any money in. It seems quite possible that, even if Wolves are flirting with the 3-year £105 million loss limit, Fosun view that as a convenient excuse to pull the brakes on their investment. Given that nearly £150 million raised in player sales over just the last 2 seasons, all of which, in the case of Morgan Gibbs-White, was recorded as pure profit since he came through Wolves' own youth ranks, combined with the fact that the cost of new arrivals is spread, or amortised, over the course of their contract length, it seems probable that, if they really wanted to, Wolves probably could spend a bit more cash this summer. Throughout the entirety of this video, it's almost like I've been having flashbacks to exactly 12 months ago when I made a very similar video about Leicester City. At that time, talk of Leicester being in trouble was viewed as almost being a bit contrarian, and even I didn't think they'd actually go down. But we all know what happened there. Like Wolves, coming off the back of a golden era, Leicester had FFP issues, they had to sell before they could buy, they struggled to recruit all summer, and there was a creeping sense of regression throughout the club. I said the saving grace for Wolves could be Lopetegui, if he sticks around that is, but many would have reasonably said the same about Rodgers at Leicester a year ago, when he was still being touted as Pep Guardiola's most probable successor at Manchester City. Unlike Leicester, however, Wolves have actually been able to shift unwanted players and those who they already expected to leave and have generated good money in the process. And they still have the potential, unlike Leicester, to bring in some players who can give them a lift. Another stroke of luck for Wolves might just be that, even if they regress, there may well still be 3 worse teams than them this season. Luton Town and Sheffield United will have to punch above their financial weight to stay in the division, and even fellow newbies Burnley don't carry any guarantees. Nottingham Forest have had an absolutely rotten pre-season, having only just survived last time around. Bournemouth have a highly rated new manager, but still have real weaknesses dotted throughout their squad. Everton are, well, Everton, and it just seems inevitable that they'll be in the mix at this stage. Likely losing Alexander Mitrovic will be a big blow for Fulham. Crystal Palace have lost Wilfried Zaha and have only signed 2 free transfers at the time of this recording, and their manager is 93 years old. And even Brentford, as impressive as they were last season, and I am a huge admirer of them, don't underestimate the impact of losing Ivan Toney and most likely David Raya, who were arguably their 2 best players last season. The writing isn't yet on the wall for Wolves. They still have time to bring players in, lift the mood, and get Julen Lopetegui back on side. But there is certainly a sketch that is starting to emerge, and it isn't painting a positive picture at all. Uncertainty at the top of a football club almost always filters down to management, players, and performances themselves, and right now, Wolves are a very uncertain club. It is uncertain whether the owners want to sell up, it's uncertain whether they're going to make the necessary signings to compete this season, and it's uncertain whether their manager is going to be willing to stick around and see the season through to completion. As long as those 3 things are the case, whether Wolves survive by the skin of their teeth this season or not, the broader direction of travel seems inevitable. That is it for today's video. I'm sorry, Wolves fans. Not really the best one for you, I guess, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless, and everyone else. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel and my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.